Okay, so this is part two of the early colonization video, focusing specifically on the Chesapeake. We cut off at a sort of bad time in the middle of the starving time description, so if you took a break in between the last video and this one, just take a moment to kind of refresh yourself, remember where we are in the starving time. So by 1607, well actually in 1607, okay, excluding the 40 people that died on the ship over, there were 104 colonists in 1607, all right? By the spring of 1608, only 38 out of those 104 had survived. By 1609, we have 300 more immigrants come in. By the spring of 1610, only 60 of that 338, let's say, were still alive. Then by 1610, and until 1624, there were over 10,000 immigrants into Virginia. So we'll talk about why that population skyrocketed. Okay, but the 1624 population of Virginia was 1,200 people. You don't have to write this down, by the way. It's just really interesting statistics. The adult life expectancy was about 40 years, and 80%, 80% of children died before the age of 5. All right, so those statistics really kind of hammer down what we mean when we say starving time. Just some images of Jamestown. You can obviously go there to visit. You can go to Colonial Williamsburg also, which is, again, it's right by Jamestown. Now here we go. We can juxtapose Jamestown on a map. All right, so it's located on the James River here, clearly named after James, King James, yes. But one of the things you might notice, and we're familiar with the East Coast region, is how flat this land is. Okay, so it could get really swampy. This territory was just riddled with malaria. All right, so that's another reason why it was kind of, the starving time was kind of complicated by very, very frequent bouts of malaria in the region. So just not the best location in retrospect. The English people thought that it was an easily defensible location. They were used to getting attacked by sea, however. What they did not realize is that they had a very large Indian settlement that was surrounding their civilization. So it completely turned that idea of easy defense on its head. Again, just a rendering of what Jamestown looked like at the time. Kind of makes sense that the houses were made out of wood. Maybe they were this sophisticated after a while. I doubt that they would have been this nice during the starving time, just because of what we know in terms of the willingness or lack thereof of the settlers to do actual work. So this most likely is a rendering of what the architecture looked like after the starving time. Religion was not as significant in Jamestown as it was in Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay and some of the other religious colonies. Actually, Maryland, which we'll talk about at the end of this video, but nonetheless, there were, of course, religious, there were chapels, there were Anglican settlers that existed in Jamestown. Okay, so John Smith. All right, so we have John Smith the myth, John Smith the reality. We already did this in class to a certain extent. John Smith, as we know, established order in the Jamestown colony. So ultimately the idea was, with John Smith's leadership, Jamestown would become more efficient, people would actually have legitimate jobs, agriculture would become more productive. John Smith actually was very willing to communicate with the Powhatan Indians and learn some of their agricultural techniques. And this is one of the reasons why the Jamestown settlers were also able to survive, in addition, of course, to the introduction of tobacco by John Wolfe. So we can kind of, again, question or at least challenge the idea of John Smith as the American hero. Many historical revisionists actually don't think so much about John Smith as the savior, so to speak, of Jamestown, but rather John Rolfe. And we already talked about him in class, of course. Oh my goodness, this got cut off too. This I have to fix. It will drive me crazy. There we go. We see it now, right? John Smith, tobacco entrepreneur, and Pocahontas' real husband. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. Anyway, so John Rolfe, okay, he actually developed tobacco as a popular cash crop, all right? And because of tobacco, Jamestown was able to survive economically, not necessarily physically, right? We already saw the dwindling population even as late as 1624, okay? But still, the idea is that because tobacco grew very well in that kind of climate, Virginia was still a viable colony, and many Englishmen flocked there for the hope of getting rich or just to escape whatever living conditions they were facing at home in England. Okay, here we have some numbers, so I'm not going to read them for you, but you get a sense, and of course you can pause at how rapidly the tobacco industry expanded. The last bullet point there that says that Virginia becomes the child of tobacco. Essentially what that means is, if I said England, by the way, I meant Virginia. Anyway, Virginia ultimately created nothing but tobacco. So what that meant was the economy was not particularly diverse. There was a very significant need for cheap and abundant labor because the demand for tobacco was so high. So this is also going to actually at first introduce more indentured servitude, not slavery in, of course, African slavery, kind of in the traditional American understanding of slavery, right? Indentured servitude actually comes first, all right? But basically the whole child of tobacco idea is that Virginia was completely tied to the tobacco crop. All right, but nonetheless, this is interesting here that by 1619 or so, notice the drop of tobacco prices. So if you were in England, basically during the first 10 years of the Jamestown settlement, you noticed how the price of tobacco was actually very high. There was a lot of demand. And of course, there were many advertisements, many of them paid for by the Virginia Company, that were trying to convince Englishmen to come to Virginia to cultivate tobacco, right? But by the time 1618 rolls around, it drops very quickly. Now, we see that, of course, it fluctuates. One of the reasons why it drops is because the Powhatan Wars begin. Actually, in 1622, they sort of properly begin, but already there were a lot of raids on the Virginia territory, so that, of course, cuts into cultivation. And then after that, the tobacco price also declines because Virginia keeps getting bigger. So it's producing more tobacco, and there's just less of a demand because there's too much of a supply. Okay. Pocahontas, again, we talked quite a bit about the myth and the reality. One of the myths, so to speak, was that Pocahontas actually saved John Smith's life because Powhatan had John Smith's head on a chopping block ready to execute him. And then Pocahontas basically ran and saved John Smith from being beheaded. Historians argue that that did not happen. Pocahontas, as at least close to factually correct as we know. She was the daughter of Powhatan. She also did, of course, marry John Smith. When she married John Smith, she actually took an English name and she converted to Christianity. She became known as Rebecca. She had one son with John Rolfe. His name was Thomas. And John Rolfe actually was killed in 1646 at the end of the Powhatan Wars. Pocahontas actually did travel to England. She was essentially on display as an example of what the English called a civilized savage, right? So basically they were trying to convince the English people that you could convert and save, quote unquote, an Indian and kind of turn them into a, sophisticated member of English society. As we see here, of course, migration is just skyrocketing. All right. Also, just in terms of the settlements in Virginia, you can see that they are quickly proliferating. This gives us a sense of the location, the preferred location of plantations, of course, along waterways, because that made trade very easy. Large plantations also, of course, required more labor and could be huge, right? And a lot of times these plantations were very far apart as well. Okay. All right. We're going to mention this one more time later, but it's important for us to realize that the status of women in the Chesapeake was actually very interesting in the sense that so many women became widows, and also there were fewer women in the Chesapeake, which meant that they got married very quickly because there were so many more men, right? So there were many more single men in Jamestown than there were single women. It was very rare to have a single woman. And oftentimes these women were widowed, and when they were widowed, they actually inherited their husband's property. Okay, so some women actually could become extraordinarily wealthy in Jamestown, and a widowarchy, of course, refers to that term. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the Powhatan Confederacy. Okay, again, the Powhatan, again, it's an English term for the people. The Powhatan loosely refers to a language group. So again, you can see that it comprises quite a large amount of territory. And of course, here we go with Jamestown, and Chief Powhatan was the commander of the entire territory, right? Here's a woodcutting representation of Powhatan. He dominated actually just a few small tribes in the James River area. Powhatan was not in charge of the entire Iroquois Confederacy. I misspoke there. Powhatan, again, we talked earlier about how we kind of saw English maybe as allies, but then later was quite confused. So the Powhatan Wars took place between 1610 and 1646. Actually, more 1622. So I guess even the historical interpretation varies. There actually was an earlier Anglo-Powhatan War in 1610. So I would actually, this is not my original PowerPoint, I would challenge that date there. 3 wars. All you really need to know is that there was a peace treaty in 1646, literally called the Peace of 1646, or the Peace Treaty of 1646, which formally separated the land between the English and the Powhatan people. I like these 2 images because they very much contrast with one another. You have on this side an engraving of the massacre of 1622, an Indian raid on the Jamestown territory and the surrounding areas. Mateus Marion was just the artist who made the woodcutting. And then here we see a representation of the Chickahominy Treaty, which ended the first Powhatan War. And we see a very peaceful coexistence between the Indians and the Englishmen here. Okay, so the Treaty of 1646, here is literally what it did. The territory marked in red was English territory, and then all these tributary Powhatan societies along the James River, that was their area. So basically the idea was that the English could not go any farther west. Indentured servitude. Okay, so actually I want to do a part 3 here because this is really important and I do not want to skip over it. So we're going to stop here, pick up with indentured servitude, then just finish up with Maryland.